Hi guys, today we're going to talk to you about the intake process of the VITA clinic. We're going to go through a little mock interview with the client, right when the client gets to the clinic, and we're just going to kind of go through common errors that are made throughout the intake process and just some best practices so you can make this as easy as possible, because we do know that this can be a little confusing and a little bit hard for first-time VITA preparers to interact with the clients right away and make sure that they get all the required documentation. So we're just going to go through this, and hopefully you can find this useful and utilize some of the tips and tricks when you go and meet your client for the first time.
Hi, I'm Nathan.
Charlie.
How you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. How are you?
Good. We're just gonna have you sign in on the client intake sheet. Just need your name and first name and last name. And then I'll take you over here. We can have a seat. This is the state and federal intake form. So you'll just check off the boxes and fill in your personal information. If you have any questions, I'll be right over here. Just give me a holler and I'll be over to help.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks.
Alright guys, here we have the intake form, and this is something that the clients are going to fill out right when they get to the clinic, and we're going to use to actually prepare the tax return. And here in part 1, you just have basic information such as their name, address, and other basic information. And just make sure all of this is completed and filled out, and you should be good to go. Alright guys, now we're into part 2 right here, and the first part of part 2 is the marital status and household information. Here they're going to click whether they're unmarried, married, divorced, and so on. And all these different situations carry with it different tax consequences, so just make sure they understand what each one is. Moving on to number 2 right here. This is where they're going to put information on what they perceive to be dependents of theirs. And down below, they're going to list everyone who lived with them last year and anyone who they supported and did not live with them last year. And here they're going to input all the basic information regarding these dependents, such as their date of birth, relationship status, and so on and so forth. And to the right over here, this is an important part that we as preparers have to look at. This part is when we actually determine whether the listed dependents actually are dependents of the client. So various different questions, such as whether this person provided more than 50% of their support throughout the year, can have an implication on whether they can actually be claimed as a dependent. So just make sure you go through that section and you determine whether they actually qualify as a dependent.
I just want to clear one more thing up, Charlie. I see you checked no under the can anyone claim you on their tax return, and I want to be sure that you consulted your parents about this, because I'm sure they're eligible to still claim you.
Yeah, I did talk to them, and they said they were not going to claim me on their taxes.
Oh, you got the exemption this year. Good for you. Thanks.
Alright guys, moving on to the next section. As you see here, we have income and expenses. So starting with income and wages. In parentheses right here, we have a little tip for you guys. So it says Form W-2. So if they have wages, that essentially means that they're required to have a Form W-2. And then this applies to every single number that you see here. So if something's in parentheses, that is a required document if the situation is applicable to them. Then moving down to expenses, it's the same kind of thing. Some of these are more common than others, so they might have medical expenses throughout the year, real estate taxes, home mortgage interest, and so on and so forth. And once again, like we were talking about before, if it's in parentheses and that situation applies, they need that corresponding document.
How'd it go?
Pretty good. I do have one question. I marked this box unsure.
Okay.
I'm not sure about, it asked about charitable contributions, and I donated some clothes to Goodwill, so I thought maybe that would help me on my taxes, but I wasn't sure.
Okay. Well, I'm looking through the rest of your form, and it looks like you just have your scholarships and your wages. So how that works is you can deduct donations like that, but that'll be an itemized deduction. And since it was just closed, I'm assuming maybe $100 or so, whereas the standard deduction is $6,300. So you would, if you had donated about as much as $6,300, then we would deduct that type of thing. But since the standard deduction is so much larger, we're just going to stick with the standard deduction instead. So we can just mark that no and then continue with the rest.
All right, that sounds good.
Alright guys, moving on to the next section. Right here, part 4 right here is covering healthcare coverage. And because of the changes with the Affordable Care Act, this can be a confusing thing for most clients. So essentially, if they have healthcare coverage throughout the year, they are good. They don't face the possibility of having a penalty. But if they did not have healthcare coverage throughout the whole year, you will have to do some further calculations to see if they do in fact have a penalty, or if they meet some kind of other requirement and in fact don't have to pay a penalty. Some common forms that you might see are Form 1095B and Form 1095C, and each of these just go into the different healthcare plans that are available, and they can be used to exempt the taxpayer from having to pay a penalty. Alright guys, moving on to the final section right here. This is just for additional information and questions. Just one thing to point out that is kind of important is the fact that if they do want direct deposit, if they do have a refund, they're going to click yes right here. And if they do check yes, then that means that they're going to have to give you other certain information such as a blank check. So you have the routing and account number, and that's going to be used by us later when we actually prepare the tax return.
All right, I think we're all set to start working on your return. I'll take these documents up, and I just need your social security card and driver's license. Perfect. I'll start working on it, and I'll be down soon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Alright guys, just one other thing to keep in mind before actually starting the tax return is to consider whether it might be out of scope for the VITA clinic. So there are just a few common situations where a certain tax return, because of these situations, can be out of scope and correspondingly we cannot do it. A few common ones we encounter are having a Schedule C, which is where profit and loss is reported. So that's for clients that would maybe have like a side business. That's something that we cannot do. Schedule D, capital gains and losses. So if they have a brokerage account and they're generating a lot of capital gains, that's something that we cannot do as well. Schedule E, rental income. So if they have a rental property, once again, that's out of scope of the VITA clinic. Form 2106 for unreimbursed business expenses. Like we just mentioned before, we're not allowed to do any clients that need a Schedule C, which is profit or loss from a business. So in addition, we cannot cover anything that has business expenses as well. Moving expenses, so Form 3903, if the taxpayer moved throughout the year, there are certain certain things that are more difficult as well between allocating income between states. And one of those things is moving expenses. That's out of scope of the VITA clinic too. Next, Form 8806, non-deductible IRA. If that applies to the taxpayer, we cannot do that. Moving on, Form 8615, taxes for children under 14. So that's kiddie tax. So that's essentially when the parent has investment income that they try to shelter through the kid. We cannot cover that as well. That's a pretty complicated subject. And then married but filing separate. That's one other thing that's out of scope of the VITA clinic. Alright guys, so that's pretty much everything with the intake process. Hopefully you guys took some of the tips and tricks out of that. And now you guys know what to look for when you're going through the intake process, as you're going through the forms and everything else that's associated with the intake process. Now just one further thing to add, if after gathering all the information you are still uncertain about a certain issue or a certain topic that applies to the taxpayer, don't hesitate to go up and ask Bob or Mike. Both of them are more than willing to answer any questions that you still might have, and it's better to gather all the documentation now versus running back up and down the stairs throughout the time trying to look for more information from the taxpayer. So with that, we are done.